I gotta ask you a question. Do you guys have a game that you played an obscene amount of as a kid? A game that, whatever flaws it may have, you still have fond memories of. Perhaps one you still enjoy to this day. Growing up in the late 2000s and early 2010s, there was a veritable goldmine of great games that populated my childhood. Mario Kart Wii, Halo Reach, Pokemon Black, even Wally on the PS2 was a decent time. Of course, it wasn't perfect. There was definitely a lot of crap from that era. I'm not blinded by nostalgia, at least I try not to be. However, there was one game that stuck with me the most. As a kid, I had a Kindle Fire and unrestricted internet access for better or for worse, which was my first introduction to the internet as a whole. Believe it or not, out of all the things I could have done, I promptly became addicted to reading Wikipedia. Not actually reading, mind you, but looking at all the cool pictures and information boxes and data and the like. That's always just been my thing. I still do that to this day, except I actually read them now. One night, when reading about old video games, I stumbled across Mega Man. Naturally, being such a massive franchise, the absurd amount of hyperlinks made my little head happy. Back then, my family was always sort of a little behind in terms of console generations. I was satisfied with the family PlayStation 2 well into the PlayStation 3 era. With my new obsession lodged into my brain, I asked my parents for the Mega Man Anniversary Collection for Christmas, and I remember fondly that morning, the smell of monkey bread in the air, on my parents' bed in front of our glowing CRT, launching Mega Man 7. And that launched a long-time fandom that carries with me to this day. But we can't exactly just start with Mega Man 7, right? That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So today, we'll be talking about Mega Man 1. While it wasn't my first Mega Man game, I put a lot of time into Mega Man 1, just about as much as the other games in the compilation. At the time, I liked all of them. In fact, I mostly still do. But because later games would refine and iterate upon the formula, Mega Man 1 remains a very strange game compared to its sequels. Although positively received in the late 1980s, its reputation has only gone downhill over the years, especially in the face of its many arguably improved sequels. I regularly recommend and share games with my friends, and among them, Mega Man 1 has been met with indifference at best and downright negativity at worst. My opinions have ping-ponged all over the place over the years. Of course, as a kid I thought it was great, but over time its flaws did become more apparent, to the point where I considered the game borderline mediocre at one point. I guess my friends must have rubbed off on me there. Though with the various replays I've done in preparation for this video, I've realized that while Mega Man is deeply flawed, it is a much better game than I used to give it credit for. In this video, we'll be taking an in-depth look at the original Mega Man as a game, its development history, the people who made it, its legacy, and its various versions over the years. Mega Man is possibly one of the most important titles in Capcom's long, storied history. At the time, Capcom was primarily known as a developer of arcade games. Titles such as 1942, Commando, and Ghosts and Goblins were bringing in quarter after quarter, and have cemented themselves into the collective consciousness of gamers who grew up in the mid-80s. Due to high demand, Capcom's games would be ported to home consoles and computers, but they were all simply conversions of arcade titles. This is where Mega Man comes in. The game emerged out of a desire internally within Capcom to branch out into producing entirely original games for home consoles. While they weren't inexperienced with the hardware at this point, this was their first attempt at designing a gameplay experience without munching quarters. Capcom intended for this project to be primarily developed by talented young creators with a fresh fire burning within. Let me introduce you to Akira Kitamura, the director of Mega Man. Kitamura had initially joined Capcom as a graphic designer, but the siren song of game design was too great, and he quickly transferred departments. Another core member of Mega Man's team was Keiji Inafune, a young artist fresh out of college. Initially wanting to join Konami, he was encouraged by his professor to shoot for Capcom instead, where he would be assigned to the Street Fighter team. This assignment didn't last long. Since console-led development was relatively new for Capcom, the higher-ups perhaps didn't want to expend more resources than absolutely necessary, and they knew that the Mega Man staff was going to be small. Capcom felt it needed the best artist they could get, and according to Inafune, that just so happened to be him, coming into work one day to find his seat on the Mega Man team instead.
I've
always liked drawing pictures. From a long time ago, I've always wanted to be an illustrator. Just about at the time that I had graduated, video gaming companies were becoming very popular, and they had always wanted young, talented artists. And it was a good chance for me to break out, get into a company, and prove myself. So it just happened to be the right timing for me to be an illustrator.
Ultimately, the game would be developed by only 7 people. The team was undoubtedly short-handed. After all, specialization wasn't really a thing in the late 80s game development scene, but it led to every team member being in some sense involved with every aspect of the game, making it more personal than a lot of other projects. Inafune described Kitamura as a really strict guy, the one who knew exactly what he wanted and one who refused to settle for anything less, crediting Kitamura with teaching him what he knew about basic game design. Development was described as insanely hectic, an unfamiliar world surrounded by various unknowns, yet very fun despite this. Before he had settled on a definitive gameplay system or even basic character ideas, Kitamura had the concept of a protagonist with large scissors on his head, leaping around, cutting down obstacles, and slicing enemies as you progressed. While vastly different from the character we would finally get, this character would later evolve into who we now know as Cutman. While Mega Man was not the first game Kitamura would work on, being credited for game design in the NES port of Capcom's arcade title Section Z, it was his first time working as a director. To fulfill the role to the best of his ability, he felt that research would be mandatory. He picked out a bunch of different games, not just to play, but to study, specifically replaying the most difficult sections over and over. Playing through those games taught him a core element of his game design philosophy: precise, intricate enemy behavior, and level placement. Focusing on this, he believed the team could achieve a far better difficulty balance than many of the game's competitors. In 2023, for their 40th anniversary, Capcom unveiled an event called Capcom Town, which delved into the history of a select few of their catalog titles. One of the most important discoveries was the original Rockman design document, presented untranslated in the original Japanese. Thanks to user Windy, the document was translated into English, and we can now take a look at an early informative period in Mega Man's development. One of the more interesting things is that the arm cannon initially did not exist, with Mega Man firing bullets out of a hole in his hand. Unlike the final game, where your health is only affected by damage, originally the health bar was to decrease over time, giving the player at best 8 minutes of full control. The bar could be refilled with energy dropped by enemies, but once the bar hit 0, the player would lose control and could be killed by enemy attacks. Their only saving grace was if you ran out of energy in specific areas, in which one of 2 friendly robots will attempt to recharge and revive the player, with the former restoring all energy and the latter reviving only half. One of the most bizarre concepts in the document is how the amount of energy affects Mega Man's jump. Higher levels allowed the player to leap up high, but the less energy they have, the shorter the jump until they eventually run out. The document also goes into detail about a few of the special weapons. The Fire Flames, most likely becoming the Firestorm, shoots a flaming projectile onto the ground and burns a moment before dispersing, similar to the Flame Blast from Mega Man 6. Oil Man's weapon seems to function opposite to its variant in Mega Man Powered Up, with enemies slipping on it instead of Mega Man sliding on it as a weapon, with different variables for different enemies. Some are killed by it, some only slip, and some are entirely unaffected. Gutsman's weapon is largely similar to the final Super Arm, but it could throw ore at any point as a projectile, making it a little more useful than it would eventually become. Bondman's weapon sticks enemies in place, perhaps recycled for Iceman's Ice Slasher, but the more interesting aspect is that the player acquires a flying stick that can be used to fly through levels. This part isn't outright stated and is a little bit of interpretation on my part, so take this with a grain of salt, but it seems like the player was meant to encounter the bosses multiple times throughout a level, as can be seen here with Gutsman appearing twice in his pre-production level layout. While the design document is interesting and decidedly different, to say the least, it's not what Capcom would eventually decide on. Kitamura felt that most action games at the time suffered from unbalanced difficulty spikes, bottlenecking players, and making the games feel more difficult than they actually were, compromising the core game design. One of Kitamura's primary intentions was for Mega Man to be highly replayable. It's important to remember that around this time, home console games were typically only around 2 to 5 hours long. Replayability adds value to shorter games, and Kitamura conceptualized many special design tricks to ensure this. He wanted to make a game where each level could be completed in about an hour, a game that players would return to even after completion. To ensure this, he went out of his way to calculate how long it would take Mega Man to walk through each stage, and determine the number of stages from that point, intending to split the game equally between the Robot Master and Dr. Wily stages. To this end, he conceived of a few rules regarding enemy placement. Weaker enemies would appear in waves of 3 or 4. They'd all use identical attacks, and the difficulty would be adjusted via the level's terrain obstacles in accordance with changing enemy placement. And while the difficulty would gradually rise, the final enemy would appear to be weaker than its immediate predecessors, leaving what he would call a softer impression of the game's difficulty. This was a subliminal trick to make the players feel as if they were improving in skill. He believed that poor balancing was the core reason why players did not replay games, as their minds would drift to the most frustrating and annoying parts rather than the gestalt of the game. A replay would instead feel like tedious busy work rather than an exciting idea in their minds. Another member of Capcom core to Mega Man's development was Nobuyuki Matsushima, the game's lead programmer. Hailing from a background in industrial manufacturing, Matsushima's code was described as flawless and meticulous. Coming from an industry where a single bug could cost someone their life, he had to be a perfectionist when it came to programming machinery, a philosophy that would carry into his work on gaming. That's not to say Mega Man was bug-free. The game's many glitches and exploits have long been documented, but Kitamura credits that to his own failing rather than Matsushima's. There was an issue, however. As meticulous as he was, Matsushima's code was slow. Due to his prior work, his code featured a plethora of safety checks, guzzling processing power by the bucket, with his code for hit detection being a particular issue. This ended up being a massive limitation for the game. Kitamura's original vision featured far more enemies on screen at once, which became an impossibility with Matsushima's style. Designing a game with less enemies on screen actually gave the team enough processing power to add new features, such as a layering effect on Mega Man's sprite, which actually consists of 2 sprites, one for his body and one for his face. Nevertheless, Kitamura still credits Matsushima as the man that really brought Mega Man to life. Kitamura's biggest wish for Mega Man was to integrate proper interactability between the special weapons, enemies, and the environment. From baddies to trees and even special walls, the goal was to make absolutely everything in some way affected by your weaponry. These weren't to be simple visual changes either. Kitamura intended for these changes to benefit or even, in some cases, hinder the player. Bosses were to be the biggest showcase of this. An example Kitamura has provided in the past goes as such. If you burnt the boss with a flame weapon, but freeze them afterwards, their defense would increase exponentially, actually backfiring on the player. But if you use their weakness, they'd break apart and you'd be rewarded with a new item. Other examples include the boss expanding in size or dividing and multiplying like a cell undergoing mitosis. Kitamura's ambitious plans were shot down by Matsushima, who figured that if he kept going, there'd be no end to it, and the programming workload would increase exponentially. This, in some sense, did make it into the final game. If you use the rolling cutter against Elecman, his Thunder Beam will actually bounce off of you. Though you'll still take full damage, it's simply a visual effect. Kitamura intended to bring these concepts into Mega Man 2 as well, however, it still wouldn't escape the cutting room floor. This idea wouldn't fully come to fruition in the classic series until Mega Man 7 in 1995, which featured a full execution of this concept. This wasn't the only cut mechanic that would eventually be reused, however. In retro game circles, it's often facetiously mocked that Mega Man somehow cannot crouch. Obviously, this is just a joke, and everyone knows it's just a consequence episodes of games having specially designed mechanics and not fully representing what a character could realistically do. According to Inafune, at some point there actually was a dot graphic of Mega Man crouching, though it was cut for a few reasons. Firstly, Kitamura had already developed the philosophy of simple controls offering deep gameplay, and crouching felt superfluous under that mindset, but it also had mechanical issues as well. Within the fast-paced gameplay that Capcom had designed, deciding in a split second whether the projectile could be crouched under or jumped over was frustrating and unclear. This mechanic would eventually make its debut in Mega Man X5 in 2000, though its inclusion in later games would be inconsistent, with some adopting it and others avoiding it. Funnily enough, the game's American manual still mentions this. A control diagram is offered, but it's far different than how the final game actually controls. For starters, it states that you can press down on the D-pad to crouch, which is of course not possible, though oddly enough, it also states you can press up to leap upwards, something that's never mentioned anywhere else. What makes this especially bizarre is that the same diagram states that the A button makes the player jump, which is true. It's possible that the manual was written during a period of development where Mega Man could crouch, and jumping was bound differently, which is what makes this quite an interesting anomaly. Although, it's just as possible that whoever wrote it was just downright incorrect without any real basis. We don't really have any way of knowing. One of Capcom's goals was to make sure the game had a huge cast of characters that any kid could enjoy. It was determined early on that cuter character designs were far easier to achieve on the Nintendo Entertainment System than more realistic ones. The team was part of one of the first generations to experience anime, and Mega Man wears its inspirations on its sleeve. The most obvious examples are the works of Osamu Tezuka, specifically Astro Boy, but others such as Kasern and Time Bokan also served heavy influence. It wasn't just anime though. Tokusatsu shows such as Kamen Rider and Ninja Captor, as well as American comic books such as the X-Men, also served as heavy amounts of inspiration, the latter of which was the main design ethos behind Elecman, the first robot master Inafune ever did for the project. Funnily enough, Inafune struggled to make Elecman not resemble a sadomasochism queen. Real-life people and mythology also had some influence, with the designs of Dr. Light and Dr. Wily being based on Santa Claus and Albert Einstein respectively. When Inafune was moved to the project, the basic designs for Mega Man, Cutman, Iceman, Gutsman, Fireman, Roll, and Dr. Light had already begun to take rudimentary form, with Cutman and Iceman in particular remaining very similar to their original concepts. As the new guy, Inafune was tasked with creating Elecman and Bombman while making adjustments to the others. One of Inafune's focuses was his regard that, at the time, the NES did not have any great characters, saying that even Mario had strange aspects of his animation, such as, quote, shooting fireballs out of his stomach, unquote. This inspired the team to make animations that were realistic and actually made sense within the game's visual style, aiming to replicate the look of anime. For example, Mega Man fires out of an obvious cannon instead of indistinctly out of his arms. Creating the designs was rather challenging, and working around the NES's technical limitations was a necessity. Inafune would do the basic sketches in his sketchbook before trying to create the 8-bit sprites before any finalized artwork was actually made, going back and forth until he achieved satisfying results. Starting from pen and paper would often lead to radically different designs at the end of the road due to hardware limitations, so characters had their designs finalized as sprites first, with detailed artwork made later, in order to ensure the designs would, first and foremost, look good on the NES. This was reportedly Inafune's main dilemma when working on the original Mega Man, though he found sometimes limitations resulted in more interesting designs. For example, the design document showcases Mega Man's arm transforming into whatever weapon he copied, something possibly cut for this reason. Many of the cut designs, such as the Springer, would appear in later games, though naturally with changes. These graphical limitations affected Mega Man himself. Inafune wanted to go for something simple and cute, while also having a detailed character sprite. Kitamura originally envisioned Mega Man as white, like a small mochi ball, which was meant to amplify the visual impact of each individual weapon palette. However, this posed a problem with sprite animation, as having him be a single color would make animations far less clear. The NES's color palette is fairly limited, and the color with the most available shades just so happened to be blue. Therefore, it was chosen for Mega Man to add greater nuance to his design. Many creative hardware tricks were required to execute certain character concepts. For example, the Yellow Devil was far too large to represent with a simple sprite, but the team felt he wouldn't be particularly interesting if he was just a background layer with projectiles. Reportedly, they pulled every trick in the book to make sure the final devil would work as intended. Even naming the main character went through multiple iterations. The initial concept was Mighty Kid, which branched off into Knuckle Kid, Battle Kid, Rainbow Warrior Miracle Kid, and the Battle Rainbow Rockman. Of course, Capcom would eventually settle on simply Rockman, but it shows just how much often changes during the development process. The game was planned to feature 8 robot masters, but due to a lack of resources, the number had to be cut down to 6. If we take another look at the Rockman design document, we can see that few of these designs are finished. Cutman, Gutsman, and Fireman are essentially finalized, but the rest are in varying stages of completion. Bombman, known as Bomberman at this point, is dramatically different, featuring a bomb for a head instead of the mohawk look seen in the final. Elecman is perhaps the most distinct, resembling a Tesla coil instead of the masked villain we know today. 3 of these robot masters didn't even make it into the final game. There's Oilman, who would later be added to the game's remake, Mega Man Powered Up, in 2006, with a very unfortunate redesign. Bubbleman, who would re-emerge in Mega Man 2 in 1988, shares many similarities with Iceman, which leads to the possibility that he could have evolved into Iceman during development. Bondman is the only robot master who wouldn't re-emerge in some form, essentially being a walking tube of glue. Though an appearance in Hitoshi Ariga's manga, The Men Who Created Rockman, based on Inafune's description, has led to him gaining a small cult following amongst Japanese audiences. Inafune considered adding him to Powered Up, but decided against it to preserve his status as a gaming legend. Music has always been intrinsically tied to Mega Man since the very beginning. The franchise is often acclaimed for its musical scores, considered a consistent highlight of the series, but this extends beyond the music itself. Capcom hoped that the thematic connection to music would help with marketing, but due to the localization, this isn't nearly as obvious to English-speaking players. In Japanese, Rockman and his sister Roll form an obvious connection to the genre of rock and roll, but the renamed Mega Man's connection isn't as clear. It wouldn't be until Mega Man 4 that it was clarified to English-speaking audiences that Rock was his real name, and Mega Man was more like his superhero moniker. According to Inafune, this direction was due to the power of music itself. Music is something that everyone understands, something everyone connects with on some level. He hoped it would allow the player to buy the concept more, so to speak, by grounding it within our own culture.
Actually, it's not a rock like a stone or a pebble. That was not where the name Rockman comes from. It comes from rock and roll. There's also another character named Roll. When I first designed the character, I had rock and roll in mind. For me, Rockman, or Mega Man, has always been a game that's been designed with music in mind. Music's always been a very important part of the series.
This trend would continue throughout the rest of the series in some form, such as Mega Man's brother Blues or his arch-rivals Bass and Treble. Speaking of music, the game's score was composed by Manami Matsumae, a prolific video game composer, as one of her first projects. She's since worked on many classic Capcom titles, such as Mercs and Magic Sword, and recently she's been known for her contributions to Mega Man 10, Shovel Knight, and Mighty No. 9. During development, Kitamura would impart his vision for the boss's individual characteristics and their stages for inspiration. Likewise, he also stated that Mega Man himself should be associated with a heroic, bright, and lighthearted tone. Following this, Matsumae composed each track with the stage theme in mind. Cutman's theme suggests metal, Elecman themes suggest electricity, and so on. Curiously, Kitamura saw the Wily levels as, in a sense, the true beginning of the game. feeling the idea of Mega Man storming the factory alone with the weapons of his fallen brothers to be profoundly tragic. When hearing the final track composed for the level, he described it as every bit as splendid as I had imagined, describing Matsumai's music as conveying a deep commitment to the game's atmosphere. When asked by Chris Greening of Square Enix Music Online whether she felt her score had an industrial feeling, Matsumai admits she had never thought of it that way. She claimed that she didn't have a whole lot of time to think about the music in a deeper sense, having to compose the music, produce the sound effects, and program the data in only 3 months. Despite this, she admits that as development progressed, she felt a sense of sorrow about the character, feeling the inner side of him, despite her initial impression being one of a robotic coolness. Composing music around the limitations of the NES was challenging and required almost Herculean patience, which Matsumai admitted in the interview that she no longer had. When working with the system, you're limited to only 3 notes at a time, a restriction that often led to a sense of accomplishment for Matsumai, finding it fun to constrain herself within set limits. Acting as both composer and sound programmer, Matsumai had to program each note individually, which took an ungodly amount of time. When hitting writer's block, she'd spend time creating sound effects instead, a process she'd use to clear her mind. Her biggest struggle when working on Mega Man was that the studio deadline was always too close, something which, according to her, was a consistent problem working at Capcom. While it's unknown why exactly she left Capcom after just 3 short years, it wouldn't be surprising if this was a factor. When the development of Mega Man 2 began, Matsumai didn't want to pass advice onto her successor, feeling that her advice would clash with the planner's direction, causing a storm of rewrites. Despite her hardships working on the project, she looks back on her time with the game fondly, stating that she found it difficult to express her combination of embarrassment and happiness. Nevertheless, she found it amazing that her games were enjoyed worldwide, and expressed joy in being able to participate in them. Kitamura himself credits Matsumai's score as the main reason Capcom's management took notice of the game to begin with. Finally, after a stressful production, Mega Man was completed and taken to Capcom's sales department. The initial reaction was negative, with management supposedly saying, "There's no way this'll sell." This left Inafune with a feeling of great disappointment, feeling he had tried his hardest and despite that, still failed.
After we got the game done, we took it over to sales. And we said, look, we got the game done, this is what it's like. And they said, there's no way this will sell. So I was really disappointed, of course. I was like, well, I tried my best, my hardest, really worked hard at it, and it didn't work out.
Nonetheless, Capcom did decide to grant the game a limited Japanese release, launching for the Nintendo Family Computer on December 17th of 1987. And to their surprise, it managed to garner a following, prompting plans for a North American release.
Capcom.
When localized for the West, there were some fairly major changes made. The game's protagonist, Rockman, was reportedly changed to Mega Man by Capcom's then senior vice president, Joseph Morisi, who felt the original title was simply horrible. I do want you to keep in mind that I couldn't find the Game Players issue in which this was supposedly stated, so take that with a bit of a grain of salt. He wasn't the only character to receive such a change. His creator, known as Dr. Wright with an R in the Japanese version, would be renamed to Dr. Wright with a W in the English localization, a change that would be made a second time in Mega Man 2, where he would receive his final English name, Dr. Light. There's also the title screen, which went from being stylish and detailed in the Japanese version to fairly typical of the time in the American version, though to its credit, it did introduce the now iconic classic English logo. Most importantly, however, the game's plot was entirely rewritten. While the basic scenario is essentially the same, the devil's in the details, and the details are borderline unrecognizable. The game now takes place in Monsteropolis, the strange, multifaceted land of robot-like humanoids. Dr. Light and Dr. Wily were partners instead of college classmates, attempting to build near-human robots, strange misrepresentations of human beings. These humanoids take over 7 separate societies within Monsteropolis after being reprogrammed by Wily for world domination. While Mega Man is merely ignored by Wily in the original Japanese backstory, he valiantly defies reprogramming here and is chosen as the defender of the universe and its inhabitants. Needless to say, no future game, Japanese or English, would ever reference these events, and they are strictly non-canonical. It's an infamously absurd localization, and one that's funny to look back on now, but probably caused a decent amount of confusion back in the day, with people going back to Mega Man 1 after having played the sequels. Perhaps most infamous is the game's North American box art, often relentlessly mocked and considered some of the worst cover art of all time. Reportedly made in only about 6 hours by a friend of one of Capcom's marketing professionals, it featured a middle-aged man in a yellow-blue jumpsuit instead of the blue bomber we know today. Inafune himself blames the box art for the game's relatively poor sales in North America. Despite unimpressive sales, it was considered a sleeper hit that largely spread through word of mouth, despite little to no American marketing. It sold well enough in Japan to warrant a reprint in 1988. At the time, it was mostly received fairly well. In an issue of Japanese gaming magazine Weekly Famitsu, the game scored a 24 out of 40 from 4 different reviewers, what is essentially the equivalent of a 60 out of 100 or 6 out of 10. It was a fairly lukewarm review overall. All 4 reviewers were greatly impressed by the amount of freedom the game offered with its level select feature, though all noted that the game was incredibly difficult, with one even stating that he couldn't reach any of the 6 bosses, blaming it as a balancing problem. It's interesting to note that even on release, the game was noted for its difficulty, a reputation that followed the game for nearly 4 decades. It was received far better by the European gaming magazine The Games Machine, scoring it an 83 out of 100, noting the game's graphics as especially impressive, though describing the game's music as average, concluding by lamenting that Mega Man 2 hadn't been released in Europe yet. It even won Best 8-Bit Console Game at the 1991 Golden Joystick Awards. Modern reviews have also been largely positive, with IGN giving the game an 8 out of 10 and Allgame awarding it a perfect score. It's also been subject to numerous accolades from gaming publications, with IGN, Nintendo Power, and OneUp.com ranking it as one of the best NES games of all time. Modern reputation amongst general audiences, however, has been less than positive. Looking at sites like Backlogged, the game maintains a polarizing reception. While many appreciate the base gameplay mechanics and the many innovative ideas the game poses, many people are put off by the game's difficulty and many aspects of the level and game design. It's sad to see the game's reputation decrease over time, but to some extent I do understand why. As is Capcom tradition, Mega Man has received a wide variety of ports over the years. The original game released exclusively for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987, and for a solid 12 years, exclusivity of the original game was maintained. It would first be ported to the Sony PlayStation in 1999 as part of Rockman Complete Works, an initiative on Capcom's part to port the original 6 NES games to the platform. It would be included as part of the Mega Man Anniversary Collection for 6th generation consoles in 2004, which was my introduction to the series and a compilation that I have fond memories of despite any issues it may have. 2 flip phone ports would release in 2004 and 2007 respectively, the latter of which actually allows you to play as Roll, a feature that remains exclusive to this port even to this day. It's been a mainstay of Nintendo's Virtual Console service, debuting on the Wii in 2007, 3DS in 2012, and Wii U in 2013. The PS1 port even got re-released on the Japanese PlayStation Network for the PlayStation 3 in 2009, and was even brought to the US entirely uncredited and translated in 2011. The version most people are familiar with nowadays is the Mega Man Legacy Collection, released for the PS4, Xbox One, PC, and 3DS in 2015. In 2017, it would receive a couple of notoriously awful ports for Android and iOS, which were seemingly based on the earlier flip phone ports. Most recently, the Legacy Collection was ported to the Switch in 2018. I'll try to cover some of these versions in depth later in the video. Mega Man would also be remade twice, a rarity for a game in general. Firstly as part of Mega Man The Wily Wars in 1994 for the Sega Genesis, which also included remakes of 2 and 3, and secondly as Mega Man Powered Up for the PlayStation Portable in 2006, which featured additional bosses and playable characters among other things. Hopefully you've enjoyed this rather long development section, but if you'd still like to know more, I'm including all of my research sources in the description below if you'd like to do further reading, which I'd highly recommend. There's a lot of interesting stuff in those sources that's impossible to cover in totality in just one video. "1987 was one of those watershed years in gaming. Final Fantasy, Metal Gear, Contra, Street Fighter, Double Dragon, Maniac Mansion, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! A year full of innovation and creativity. And out of those titles, I think Mega Man gets overlooked. Don't get me wrong. It's hardly an obscure game by any means, but when its far superior sequel would release only a year later, it's easily overlooked. I mean, I get it. Mega Man 2 was far more successful, and the ways it improved upon the formula cannot be understated. However, I'd argue most of what made that original game so memorable, at least from a game design perspective, originated here, albeit in a far less refined form. It might seem a bit quaint nowadays, especially with how long the series has gone on, but the base formula here is not anything anyone had seen before in 1987. Allowing the player to tackle the stages in any order is frankly a little mind-blowing. While non-linearity wasn't necessarily new in platformers, after all, Super Mario Bros. Featured the Warp Zone as early as 1985, Mega Man was the first to make this a core game mechanic, and it's part of what makes the game so replayable. While Mega Man fans always have their own optimal routes, coming back to the game to choose, say, Fireman from the get-go instead of the far easier Bomb Man makes replays more interesting. That alone is worthy of praise, but it wouldn't be nearly as successful of a formula if not for the rock, paper, scissors gameplay philosophy. Each robot master has a weakness, stemming from one of 6 special weapons. Discovering which bosses are weak to what is an exercise largely in guesswork, but it injects a lot of strategy in how you proceed, especially on replays. It would be extremely challenging to tackle Elecman first, but if I take him out now, I'll have the Thunder Beam for the rest of the game. And these sort of decisions are part of what makes Mega Man so compelling. It's a winning formula right out of the gate, and when there are over 30 games that follow this formula, it's clearly one with staying power. Well, that's just what happens when you're on the stage select. What happens when you actually start playing? Well, you're treated to some of the smoothest controls in the 3rd generation. The game feels incredibly tight to play, and the near unprecedented amount of air control the player is given feels great. Platforming in this game often feels very satisfying as a result, and there's a reason that, despite future games refining the controls and adding new mechanics, the base movement hasn't changed all that much, at least in the classic series. It all feels very liberating compared to other console games at the time. For example, just compare Mega Man to Konami's Castlevania, with its stiff controls and jump commitment. For the record, I actually do really like how Castlevania controls. I'm just pointing out how Mega Man is unique in this regard. I also really enjoy how much emphasis there is on combat in this game. In many platformers, enemies feel more like stage hazards than anything else, but in Mega Man, enemies can stop you dead in your tracks if you don't learn their patterns. Mega Man is often considered one of the hardest games on the NES, but I can't help but feel that reputation is a bit over-exaggerated. Look, my perspective on the game's difficulty is incredibly biased. I've beaten this game like 4 times since I started making this video, and I've beaten it many more times since I was 8 years old. I know the game's ins and outs, and I can't come at this from the perspective of someone new to the game. Frankly, I'm used to its bullshit. For example, the Yellow Devil is a widely hated boss, and most people use the pause resume trick, an exploit in which the game's hitboxes are regenerated every frame when pausing and unpausing to defeat it. Regardless, I never actually use this trick when replaying the game, because I find that his pattern is just so repetitive that with trial and error, the player can figure it out just fine. Even the platforms at the beginning of Gutsman's stage I find easy once the timing clicks. Ultimately, that's just the loop with Mega Man 1. There are certain things attributed to extreme difficulty that I personally think just need multiple attempts to properly overcome. That's not to say Mega Man doesn't have its flaws though. There are plenty of moments where it feels like the game hates you. Going back to Gutsman's stage, look at these spikes that you'd have absolutely no idea exist before falling into them, wasting a precious life in what is already considered a difficult stage by most. Speaking of spikes, the lack of invincibility frames is very obnoxious. There are many moments where a floating enemy, such as this Mambu in Bomb Man stage, can plunge you into certain death with no chance of recovery, which feels very unfair. The footholders are seemingly programmed to go in inconsistent and difficult to predict directions, which at best wastes your time and at worst sends you plunging again. The boss fights themselves aren't particularly good in this game either. While some, such as Cutman, Bomb Man, and Gutsman, are perfectly fine, others such as Elecman and Fireman feel like a competition to see who can spam their weapons the fastest. It's somewhat alleviated by how much fun the special weapon system is, but they're far from perfect. Speaking of the special weapons, I remember finding them unimpressive for most of my life, but nowadays I recognize that the weapon set is fairly decent. The Thunder Beam is the obvious pick here, annihilating anything in its path, but the Firestorm, Ice Slasher, and Rolling Cutter have enough use within their niches to be solid picks as well. The Hyper Bomb I never found much use for outside of Gutsman. It just takes way too long to detonate, and it feels like it slows the game down to a crawl. I mostly take issue with the Super Arm, which doesn't have any ammunition of its own, rather requiring you to pick up large blocks scattered throughout the stages. The problem is that these blocks are infrequent at best and render the weapon largely situational, if not outright useless outside of bosses in most scenarios. No Mega Man game is ever going to have a perfect roster of weapons, no matter how much you try, and for what it's worth, the first game provides a decent enough selection, but it lacks the fine-tuning that many later games feature. The lack of any sort of progress keeping whatsoever also hurts. I'm not expecting saving of any kind. Although Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda had been ported to NES just a few months prior and featured a save system of its own, such features were not just uncommon at the time, but expensive due to requiring battery backups built directly into the cartridges. However, the lack of any sort of password system whatsoever, something that many NES games, much less the game's 5 sequels had, means that Capcom expects you to beat Mega Man in one sitting. While this doesn't matter that much nowadays due to the modern compilations properly saving and emulations universally featuring save states, back in '87 I imagine it being a major inconvenience, especially with how difficult the game is. I personally do prefer beating it in one sitting, but I also understand that preference is far from the norm, especially for first-time players. I also want to bring up the game's completely pointless score system. Capcom was known primarily as a developer of arcade games, and with Mega Man being their first proper console game, it makes sense that some of those sensibilities bleed into it. There's nothing wrong with the game having a score system, but it's weirdly useless in execution. The game doesn't save these scores or even have a high score table at all, so there's no way to compare scores unless you took a picture at the end, which in the late 80s was far more inconvenient than a simple screenshot. It doesn't help that these scores aren't even based on your accomplishments. The scores you get for beating the Robot Masters are entirely randomized, so you're just presented with a tally at the end of the game that ultimately represents absolutely nothing. If you want a more in-depth look at the score system, please watch the Retro Dude's short yet highly informative video on the subject. Look, Mega Man is a deeply flawed game from a design perspective, and it's completely fair that players both past and present bounce off of it due to its high difficulty and inconsistent design. But for me personally, it also deserves praise for its great core gameplay mechanics, bold innovation, and for immediately solidifying what I find to be a very addictive core gameplay loop. Are there better Mega Man games out there? Absolutely. pretty much every mainline classic title is better than Mega Man 1, but it's still a game I enjoy coming back to nonetheless. I'm a big fan of Capcom games, and I believe that most of the time, great graphics are something you can typically expect from their output. I said most of the time. When you think of NES games, it's not uncommon for people to perceive them as archaic visual representations of realism or cartoons. While I think there are a lot of great-looking, if not visually excellent NES games, they tend to look great in isolation and don't always fully represent their concept artwork. These developers ultimately cannot be blamed. The NES wasn't even the most powerful system of its generation, and these games look great anyways, so whether that actually matters is up for debate, but I think Mega Man was, for 1987 at least, one of the few games that truly conveyed its art style almost perfectly into 8-bit form. Look at the NES port of Konami's Contra, for example, which released a couple of months later. While I would never call Contra a bad-looking game whatsoever, it's difficult to argue that it resembles its original Japanese artwork, and again, nor can Konami be blamed for that. This just further emphasizes that what Capcom achieved here is truly remarkable, at least for its time. If you compare and contrast Mega Man's artwork with its sprite work, it's crazy how close of a match it often is. This is most likely a result of the team designing the character sprites first, before developing them into detailed art, and it paid off. It means that these simple designs pop, especially for 87 when sprites were often just amorphous figures resembling people. The game looks significantly less flat than a lot of its competition, and smaller details really add up. I mean, Mega Man blinks. He blinks. This sounds like a joke, but it genuinely helps make him seem more alive, especially impressive when you remember that it's actually two sprites laid directly on top of each other. The designs for the Robot Masters, while a bit more simplistic than what we've come to later expect from the series, have still cemented themselves as iconic designs. Cutman looks like he's from a tokusatsu show, Elecman looks straight out of an American comic book, and Gutsman is such a strong design that it's been repeated ad nauseum both in-universe and in real life. This extends to basic enemy designs too. While I do have a soft spot for the Crazy Razies and Picket Men, who would have expected an invincible construction helmet to be so enduringly popular? Upon replaying the game for this video, I was struck by how good the tile work was in particular. Look at the tiles that make up the general structure of a Lekman stage. The highlights, shading, and use of color make it nearly pop out of the screen, or smaller details such as the pods within the walls that zap with electricity, or in Iceman stage where the different levels of value across the brick wall convey depth and dimension. The only real complaint I have about the game's graphical presentation is that, compared to later NES Mega Man titles, it does often seem a bit flat. Backgrounds are quite often just a solid color without much in the way of detail, and enemies can't often help but feel a bit static compared to how much more expressive they are in later games, especially compared to Mega Man 5 or 6, games that push the NES to its absolute limits. It's not something I hold against the game at all. After all, none of its competition reached those heights either, and the era it was released in is a very important thing to consider, but it is definitely true that the NES was capable of quite a bit more. In any case, Mega Man 1 still looks great, if not stunning in many ways for an NES game released in 1987. While there are certainly much better looking games on the NES, certainly within its own series, any rough edges are largely attributed to an art form still grappling with the increased power of third-generation consoles. You might remember earlier in this video that Akira Kitamura assigns most of Capcom's interest in the game to the work of one Manami Matsumae, and it's very easy to see why. From the moment you select a stage, you're met with a now iconic 6-second stinger that builds anticipation through a series of climbing notes, and this sets the stage for what to expect fairly well. While not exactly the best showing for the franchise, even on the NES, Matsumai's chiptune score is incredibly important to laying the foundations for what exactly defines a Mega Man soundtrack. Each track feels unique and embodies its assigned stage perfectly. Cutman's theme bounces back and forth, and the song's rhythm is incredibly catchy and always causes my head to bounce from side to side. Listening to it reminds me of the rolling cutter spinning around the boss arena. The deep, climbing notes and groovy bass of Gutsman's theme exude tension, especially during the opening platforming section. Perhaps it's a bit overly simplistic, something future rearrangements would attempt to remedy, but it always gets the hairs on my neck standing straight up. Fireman's theme is evocative of ascending flames and pillars of fire and is probably one of my favorites in the game. It really is an incredibly memorable theme for a very memorable stage. Elecman's theme has, well, an electric energy to it, with energetic dancing notes, and its upbeat nature fits the level's tower ascent perfectly. It all comes to a head in the game's best track though, Dr. Wily Stage 1, a deeply moody, tense, and dramatic track, the culmination of everything the game tries to achieve musically. Special credit should go to the ending theme, which through future rearrangements would essentially end up becoming the theme of Mega Man. It's not all sunseekers and rainbows though. There are moments where the soundtrack struggles to find its footing, such as Iceman's theme, which has always sounded unfocused to me, the boss theme, which sounds sloppy and undefined, and Dr. Wily Stage 2 being a simple set of relatively uninteresting scales. It's a bit on the rougher and more simplistic side of things, but Matsumai's score for Mega Man is iconic for a reason. Not only did it lay the foundations for a series now renowned worldwide for its music, but most of these tracks are incredibly catchy and convey the intended stage themes very well. Although the series would improve musically over time, the original game still has a very good score that holds up incredibly well. I play a lot of older games. Not necessarily because I prefer them, but because I think most games have aged far better than they're often given credit for. Being a fan of retro games, however, comes with a growing, unfortunate realization. Can I even recommend these games to people? I'm not even talking about games being too old or too dated for the average person, but rather, can they even find these games? Are they even accessible to the average person? Although game preservation and accessibility are major issues, thankfully Mega Man does not fall into this. The game is widely available through official channels on every major platform, and I think there's a lot that's commendable about that. Whether it be PC, PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, you can go and buy this game alongside its first 5 sequels anywhere. But I want to go through as many of the different ports and re-releases as I can, if only for fun's sake. I need to give an important disclaimer though. I am a PC gamer at heart. Although I grew up with consoles, ever since late middle school, my focus has largely shifted to PCs. This is a long way of saying I don't actually own any of the consoles I'll be looking at today. I'll be showcasing these different versions through the magic of emulation, for strictly educational purposes for any companies watching. This review has been based entirely on the original NES version, emulated through the Meson emulator. But for this particular section, I'll be looking at the Japanese PS1 port, the Anniversary Collection, the Legacy Collection, and the Android port, with the first two using the DuckStation, PCSX2, Dolphin, and Zemu emulators respectively. The Legacy Collection will be the PC version as available on Steam, and the Android port will just be played on my Galaxy S21. It's important to keep in mind that, while emulation has progressed greatly over the course of many years, the fact of the matter is that it isn't native hardware, and while most popular emulators feature high accuracy nowadays, there will still most likely be differences from native hardware, major or minor, and naturally, I can't begin to touch on things like video output, or which cables or scalers to use. So consider this more of an overview of these different versions, rather than 100% the experience you'd be getting on native hardware. Firstly, the Japanese PS1 port, which is for the most part a fairly straight conversion to Sony's 32-bit system. Apparently, development was outsourced to a company called Intech, at least according to the Mega Man knowledge base. I couldn't find a proper source on that. If anyone knows for sure, please let me know. Out of the gate, the best part about this port is that if you wanted to, you could essentially get a mostly similar experience to the Famicom original. While the developers added quite a few bells and whistles to this port, you don't actually have to use any of them, and I really like that. I think the main function of ports, first and foremost, is to preserve the original experience, warts and all, and that's by and large what they've done here. What if you wanted to shake things up though? You know, take advantage of 12 years of technological advancement for an improved Mega Man experience. Well, the most obvious and appreciated improvement is the ability to save. This alone adds so much to the experience and makes playing the game much more convenient. It also includes some quality of life changes, some better, some sort of unnecessary. For the former, we have the ability to switch weapons on the fly using the bumpers, which speeds up the pace of gameplay in a positive way, full controller remapping, and haptic feedback. But of course, those who prefer the traditional menu can still use it, and in some instances it may actually be preferable gameplay-wise too. For the latter though, we have a turbo button, which allows you to fire weapons far faster than you were ever intended to. While I appreciate giving the player more options, I find this often trivializes encounters by immediately destroying most weaker enemies. You certainly don't have to use it, but when it's right above the normal fire button, it's certainly tempting. There's even a database with unlockable images and lore, but due to the low image quality, it's sort of useless nowadays, if pretty cool for the time. The port offers two options, a classic mode and the new Navi mode, which features among other things, a fancy new user interface, navigational markers, and hints courtesy of Dr. Light. The new UI is pretty nice, but I have to question the navigation itself. It sort of feels like it was made for people who've never played a video game before. The game is never unclear on where to go, so I can't really imagine it being helpful in the majority of scenarios. If it helps you, no judgment, but it's not really for me. The main appeal to me, however, is the arranged soundtrack. They're not new at all. In fact, they're entirely recycled from Mega Man The Power Battle and its sequel, Mega Man 2 The Power Fighters, which released in arcades a few years prior. These specific few remixed tracks are sort of rough in an early CD game way, but they're quite appealing too. I like them a lot. For example, Gutsman's theme includes a new piano section and rhythm guitar, which fills in the dead space the original track had. Elecman's theme has pounding drums and sounds even more upbeat than it originally did. And while Dr. Wily's Stage 1 was entirely replaced with the Yellow Devil's theme from the arcade games, that's an excellent track, so it's sort of hard to complain. They play in crystal clear quality, and by and large sound great. Just make sure to hold the select button when selecting Navi mode. I have no idea why they locked it behind a button combination, but they did, and you'll have to do that if you want to hear the new music. The only issue is that the implementation of said tracks is very lazy. While there's nothing inherently wrong with reusing music from the arcade games, that's all they've done here. If a stage theme wasn't remixed for the arcade games, they weren't remixed here either. It's very jarring to go from Elecman's high-quality CD remix to Fireman's weirdly compressed 8-bit Famicom track. That's another strange thing. Despite being CD audio, the Famicom tracks sound lower quality than they do in the actual NES version. I don't know if maybe this is a difference between how Meeson and DuckStation handle audio, but when the remixed tracks sound so crisp, I kind of doubt it. It probably wouldn't make much difference on your average 90s TV speakers, but on a nice pair of headphones, it is somewhat distracting. A funny thing I noticed is that the sound effects are actually taken from the European version of the game, for whatever reason. Ultimately, Rockman on PS1 is a rock-solid port of the game, and in 1999 held a lot of value. If you were a Japanese gamer in the late 90s, this would be a great way to get into classic Mega Man, varying opinions on the original game aside. The new features are great improvements at best, and superfluous at worst. The only major issue with this conversion is the inconsistency with the remixed tracks, but that's not the only hurdle. As a Japanese-only release, you sort of need to understand Japanese to get the best out of it. It's entirely playable without that knowledge. I mean, there's very little text in the game itself, but a lot of those additional bells and whistles are hard to navigate without at least a cursory understanding. I found myself using Google Translate just to configure basic options. Obviously, this isn't a flaw with the port, but rather my own lack of knowledge. I'm sort of just being a stupid gaijin here, but it is something for English speakers to consider when selecting which version to play. Thankfully, you might not have to. Courtesy of Atomic Planet Entertainment, the PS1 port of the game was ported and localized to the PlayStation 2 and Nintendo GameCube in 2004, with an Xbox port releasing a year later. Instead of being a solo port, the Mega Man Anniversary Collection is a compilation of the first 8 mainline titles, alongside the 2 aforementioned arcade games as unlockable extras. Now, just for clarification, I'm only talking about the Anniversary Collection in relation to its conversion of Mega Man 1. I'm aware the compilation as a whole is a little hit or miss, but that's a video for another day. The first thing I'd like to mention is how cool the main menu is. It's always been something that impressed me, even during childhood. The beautiful orange sunset set against the city with these giant glass windows was always very artistically striking to me. It simply has a ton of sauce. I mean, sure, it's slightly less convenient to navigate, but I'm willing to accept the rule of cool as an appropriate trade-off here. You may feel differently, and that's completely understandable. The first thing that stands out to me is the amount of customization the compilation gives you. While the PS1 port already let you use a brand new easy mode, you can adjust the amount of extra lives you have here as well, so if you prefer your games far easier than I do, this might be a version to look into. The game even includes cool unlockables, such as artwork, new music remixes, and depending on the version, either the pilot episode of the Ruby Spears Mega Man cartoon, an episode of Mega Man NT Warrior, or an interview with Keiji Inafune. Otherwise though, this is largely just the PS1 port, but localized and wrapped in a different menu. There may be some other minor differences, but they might just be due to emulation rather than the porting job itself. Pretty much all of the bells and whistles from the PS1 port are here, and that means it inherits its issues as well, such as the inconsistency with music. Back in the mid-2000s, Anniversary Collection was an incredible bargain. Not only did you get the entire mainline Mega Man saga up to that point, but you also got 2 games that, at that point, had never been brought to home consoles before. There's a reason this compilation was a massive success, and the reason a lot of people, myself included, got invested in the series to begin with. The compilation is often accused of having input lag, and I can't speak for native hardware, but speaking strictly for Mega Man 1, I don't think this is the case, at least through emulation. I compared the PS2 and GameCube versions to the PS1 original and found that it was largely identical, at least to my eyes. Those with the tools and expertise to pick it apart will probably do a better job than I did and correct me in the comments, and rightfully so if I'm wrong, but just by eye and from game feel, they seem to be largely identical. But which version of Anniversary Collection should you play? Speaking strictly from my perspective, that's a difficult question to answer. When it comes to emulation, the PS2 version, by default, is incredibly blurry using hardware accurate settings. This can be greatly improved by increasing the internal resolution and using the anti-blur setting, which produces far sharper visuals. This does cause artifacting on text, albeit it's an easily ignorable trade-off. The GameCube version, on the other hand, requires a little more work to get a clean image. Not only do you have to increase the internal resolution and disable the copy filter, you also have to make sure texture filtering is set to force nearest, because this particular port handles certain sprites differently, and without this option, by default, some sprites will be filtered and others won't be. The GameCube version is sort of a poor option though, mainly for 2 reasons. If you choose to play a Navi mode, the rearranged music from the PS1 version is entirely absent. I have no clue why, but for whatever reason, I guess Atomic Planet just left it out of this version. I assume it's a mistake, but still, why? Secondly, the controls are bound very weirdly. Jump and fire are swapped. meaning that if you've grown used to how Mega Man games typically play over the years, you will need to make major adjustments to muscle memory to be able to play this version comfortably, and there's no controller remapping whatsoever. If you're playing on native hardware, this is potentially a deal breaker. I just don't enjoy this binding at all. I just can't get used to it, and that seems to be common consensus as well. Thankfully, if you choose to emulate this version, you can always rebind the buttons in the emulator settings, but I can't help but feel it's still generally inferior to its PlayStation cousin. But what about the much later Xbox port? One would assume that since it was developed later, it would be the best version. On paper, that seems to be the case. You have to do the least amount of effort to get a crisp image out of it, simply increasing the internal resolution. In fact, it may have the cleanest picture quality out of all three versions, at least if the main menu is to be judged. And from the get-go, other improvements make this seem like a great deal. The best part is that Atomic Planet has added multiple controller presets, so you get to choose what's most comfortable for you. There's just one issue though. I couldn't get Mega Man to start. I could navigate the menu just fine, but once I got to the game's title screen, it just wouldn't boot. I thought it was a problem with my controller, but the controller worked fine everywhere else, nor did it work on a keyboard either. If the Zemu compatibility list is to believe, Anniversary Collection runs with major crippling flaws at the moment. While Mega Man 7 and 8 are mostly playable, it seems, the NES games that actually did boot had major graphical glitches which rendered the games entirely unplayable and are unaffected by internal resolution, so clearly that's not the issue. As a result, I'd have to say, avoid the Xbox version through emulation entirely, at least until compatibility improves. If you want to play it on native hardware, I imagine it's a solid version, but I can't test that. I've also heard it has issues playing in backwards compatibility on an Xbox 360, but I can't verify that either. If you're familiar with the Xbox version, please let me know in the comments below. I'd really like to hear. Hearing all of that, you might not want to deal with the different quirks of the many versions of Anniversary Collection. Thankfully, in 2015, we would be blessed with the Mega Man Legacy Collection from Digital Eclipse, which features the 6 NES games running through their proprietary Eclipse engine, which is a fancy way of saying they've recompiled the old games into a new format, which is then fed through their engine. There's a very fascinating interview about that I'll link in the description below. This is the most modern way to play Mega Man 1, and there are a lot of nice features that make this version worth considering. It's the first official version of the game with save states. It's the first to allow you to pick between the original Japanese versions and the English localizations, and the first to let you configure options on a game-by-game basis. It features full keyboard and controller remapping, which is a big improvement over Anniversary, a nice gallery with decent quality images, a database that, while mostly fluff, does include genuinely useful information such as enemy weaknesses, a music player, and challenge modes to keep you coming back after you've beaten the games. In 2018, a few years after release, they even updated it with new features, such as a turbo mode which seeks to improve the performance issues the original games had, and a rewind feature for those who enjoy that. That's not really my thing personally, but I'm glad it's there for those who like it. If it sounds great, you're not entirely wrong, but Legacy Collection does have some flaws that should be taken into consideration. Digital Eclipse only included the original NES versions of these games. None of the additional modes or content found in the PS1 port or Anniversary Collection are included. On one hand, I do think preserving the original NES experience is far more important, but on the other hand, it would have been nice to include these features for those who preferred them, and for the sake of gaming preservation. There are some control downgrades too. You can no longer swap weapons with the bumpers like in the previous two versions, which, while not a deal breaker, was a pretty nice feature, which is strange because the turbo button was kept in this version. The menu design is sort of aesthetically sauceless to me, especially compared to the Anniversary Collection, but it's not bad looking by any means. There are also no audio options at all. The game launches incredibly loudly, and you cannot adjust volume at all in-game. I had to open the Windows volume mixer to lower it, which I don't think any game should make you do in the modern day. The game also only supports X-input compatible controllers, and I use a DualShock 4. Thankfully, Steam Input allows for an easy workaround, but it's inconvenient to have to do in the first place. The biggest issue though is how the game handles resolution, at least on PC. The game internally renders at 1080p, and higher resolutions are scaled anamorphically through bilinear filtering. I play my games in 1440p, and frankly, I think this looks pretty ugly. I'm not so sure how well well it'll come through with YouTube compression, but looking at it for too long gives me a headache. It really doesn't look good at all, and I have to wonder if they even did a significant amount of playtesting above 1080p. And no, switching my desktop resolution to 1080p doesn't fix this. According to the March 2024 Steam hardware survey, 1080p is still the most common monitor resolution among PC gamers, so most of you will probably never experience this, and it'll be perfectly fine. But if you play in higher resolutions like me, keep in mind this is something you'll have to deal with if you choose the Legacy Collection as your method of play. Otherwise, this is a very good version of Mega Man 1, and while I haven't tested the other games, I can't imagine they're too much different. The last version we have to cover is the Android port from 2017, known as Mega Man Mobile. For starters, this version has been delisted. You cannot get it through official means anymore. I'm mostly just covering it for fun. Let's start with the positives, because to be frank, there aren't many. To Capcom's credit, graphical quality is pin sharp. It looks great on my S21 screen. The port also features a boss rush mode, which is a neat idea that would make the game more appealing as a portable title, benefiting the pick up and play nature of the platform. That's about it though. For starters, the controls feel terrible. I've never liked playing platformers with a touchscreen, but this port feels especially unresponsive. Instead of having a little virtual joystick that slides across the screen as you use it, it's this weird dedicated button setup that just doesn't fit a touchscreen. You need more malleability for platformers on touchscreen, which this control setup just doesn't have. Not to mention, the controls are severely affected because performance is terrible. I don't know what happened here, but every other version of the game targets 60 FPS, and for the most part achieves it. This port runs like if you put Crysis on a Microvision. While the port does offer multiple speeds, these don't increase the frame rate, just the game speed, and therefore it doesn't help at all. In fact, debatably it makes it worse. And that shouldn't have to be the case. There are high quality NES emulators on Android that nowadays have even hit cycle level accuracy. I'm not even saying it needs to be that level of quality. After all, this port is 7 years old, and emulation technology has improved quite a bit, but there is no excuse for it being this bad. There was an iOS port of Mega Man 2 from years ago that ran far better than this ever did on much older mobile hardware. I'd go as far as to argue this port is borderline unplayable. It is exceptionally shoddy work, and a project that probably should have never released at all if this is what Capcom considered acceptable. Evidently, they agree with me nowadays, considering the port's delisting. If you're curious, this does count as abandonware nowadays and can easily be found online. Figure it out yourself, I can't tell you. But avoid this port for legitimate play at all costs. With all of this considered, which version should you go for? As I said earlier, that's not an easy question to answer. If you only own a modern console, Legacy Collection is not only your best bet, but most likely your only bet. It's a rock-solid compilation that features 6 very good, if not great, games, and is a great way to play Mega Man 1 on consoles. Moving onwards though, what if you have a capable PC and don't have any limits? This is where things get a bit complicated. Legacy Collection's PC version is generally fine, very cheap at an asking price of $15, and regularly goes on sale. It's well worth the money, even at the base price. Some of the issues I ran into, such as resolution scaling, most likely won't be an issue for the majority of people, despite still having some glaring flaws, such as the lack of a volume slider. So, yeah, I recommend it. It's a good way to play the game on PC, at least for most people. The most accurate way to experience Mega Man 1 on PC, though, will probably be through a cycle-accurate emulator such as Meson or NES-topia UE. I can't speak for NES-topia, but Meson has a lot of customizable options that Legacy Collection simply doesn't have. But naturally, it also lacks some of the fancier, more specific bells and whistles that Legacy Collection does have, such as the galleries or the rewind feature. So really, pick your poison based on what's more important to you. If you play in 1440p or above, I'd personally recommend staying away from Legacy Collection, unless you're not bothered by the bilinear filtering. Is there any reason to play the PS1 port or the Anniversary Collection on PC? Yes, I would say so. Legacy Collection lacks the specific features unique to the PS1 port, and the PS1 port, music inconsistencies aside, is a very good version of the game. The only big problem is the inconvenience of having to use a translator to configure options. So for those who don't want to bother with that and don't speak Japanese, the fully localized Anniversary Collection might be a better option. If you're emulating, however, I would stick exclusively to the PS2 version, as it has the least amount of problems, at least in my experience. The GameCube version lacks the rearranged music, and although you can fix the poor button binding with the emulation settings, the PS2 version simply doesn't have those issues to begin with, so why bother? Avoid the Xbox version entirely, at least through emulation, because as of now, it is unplayable. What if you have the original hardware though? That's tricky to answer because I don't have original hardware and can't speak from experience. I remember the PS2 version being very good, but I was also a child, so I don't trust that experience. Regardless, you should probably avoid the GameCube port no matter what, as the poor button bindings are hard-locked and it is missing music. I cannot speak for the other versions, but if emulation is anything to go by, they're probably solid ways to play Mega Man 1. The PS2 and Xbox ports are dirt cheap complete in box, and the PS1 port doesn't go for too much either. Just avoid the NES original unless you have the money to spend, because complete copies can easily go up to $600, and tends to range around $80 loose, at least as of writing. Really, the GameCube port and the Android port are the only versions you should downright avoid no matter what. Can't speak for the iOS version, but it's probably identical. As for the versions I couldn't cover in this video, let me know how they are in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think, and I'd love to hear your experiences. Out of all of the innovative, genre-defining games that released in 1987, the original Mega Man is the one I think goes most underappreciated. Often just seen as a mere stepping stone for its vastly superior sequel, a lot of what makes the franchise so compelling was established here first, and was largely accomplished pretty well at that. From an innovative approach to level progression, to great base gameplay mechanics, detailed graphics for the time, and a very catchy score, there's a lot about Mega Man 1 that is still appealing in 2024. However, the game suffers from poorly tuned, if not often unfair difficulty, which will almost certainly alienate new players. And even for longtime fans like me who are used to the difficulty, the game still displays in significant areas a lack of refinement, such as the spammy boss fights and occasionally inconsistent weapon design. It is very clear that, despite the great ideas that Akira Kitamura and his team had, many of the game's flaws come down to inexperience, something that Kitamura himself has admitted in interviews. In some ways, I understand why this game is overlooked, and it's simply because almost every mainline classic series game after this is just better. The core concepts that Mega Man 1 poses would be refined like crazy over the last 4 decades, and while not all of these games were perfect or even necessarily good, they still built upon the foundation that Capcom had laid back in 1987, and what a great foundation it was. I admire the game greatly, and that's not just academically. I revisit this game a lot. I beat the game at least 5 times for this video alone, and I didn't have to. It's because, despite its deep-cutting flaws, the game is still fun, at least to me. Now, would I recommend it to other people? The answer is complicated, as per usual for this video. For the average fan of platformers, not really. There are a ton of Mega Man games out there, and most of the good ones are better introductions to the common tropes of the series than the first game is, and are typically more consistent in quality as well. But what if you're a Mega Man fan who somehow hasn't played this one yet? My answer is absolutely. The game is only around 2 hours long, even for first-timers. It's readily accessible everywhere, and personally, I find it rewarding to explore the foundations of this great franchise. Well, what's my rating then? It's impossible for me to entirely put my life experiences with this game to the side. After all, I grew up with it. I'm used to it. This game has been with me for over a decade of my life, and it means a lot to me. But weighing the positives and the negatives, I'd give the original Mega Man a 6 out of 10. I just can't ignore its flaws. It's a very decent game and in many ways has great core aspects, but it is very, very flawed, and that is something I can't ignore, despite my experience. That's enough about me. What do you think about this game? Was it your introduction to the series, or did you end up playing it later down the line? Which version did you play? Did you learn something new from this video? I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. And yes, for those who have been patiently waiting, my next project after this is the Heavensward video. So stay put for that. I still haven't beaten it, but I will pretty soon. Thank you so much for watching, and whatever you do, don't be a Meet Miko Bob.